Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you are enjoying your weekend. I am going to get this recorded this weekend so I can get it posted first thing Monday morning for those of you who want to get your homework done quickly. Um, in class this week, we're starting with talking about going to war and what it was like to fight the fascists and how important it was to stand up for those things that were right and how difficult it was in some instances, how it was easy for some, and others lost their lives, others it wasn't so easy. So we're going to talk about that in class, and now we're moving on to the Fair Deal, President Truman's administration, and trying to contain the Soviets. So that's where we're headed, the beginning of the Cold War. Here we go. After World War II, focus changes in the United States from war, which had pulled us completely out of the Depression. Think about those pictures that I showed you from the video of what it was like to live during the Depression, the horrible conditions. This is the inside of a grocery store in Illinois in the late 1940s, showing the complete difference of what was happening in the economy. There was a focus now on abundance and cultivating in America what is called, quote, the American way of life, which was basically a lot of consumerism. We'll talk about that and as we get farther into the 1950s. By 1947, the military had shrunk from 12 million to just 1.5 million. Think about that. What 12 million troops when in 1939 we had 175,000. That's interesting that it changed that quickly in 1947. So in 8 years, we had gone from 175,000 to over 12 million, and then we're shrinking it back down to 1.5 million. This placed many veterans in need of education, employment, and housing. The birth rate increased after the war, and Americans born during this time came to be known as the baby boomers. It's a generation between 1946 and 1964. During the war, prices had been frozen to prevent price gouging. Now with the war over, the government released their control on the economy and prices skyrocketed. When wages were not raised to compensate, several unions went on strike. So all of FDR's control that had happened during the war, some of it slowly goes away, like price gouging and unions not striking, that kind of stuff. After less than 12 weeks as vice president, Harry Truman was sworn in as president, and he was FDR's opposite in very many ways. When Truman came into the presidency, he replaced many of FDR's cabinet members while favoring many of the New Deal programs. The government's reaction to basically life in the economy post-World War II. Congress offset the financial impact of demobilization by providing unemployment insurance and money to attend colleges and trade schools. For the most part, the Truman administration was successful in combating the strikes, but after the 1946 elections, he gave up the battle and the unions gained strength. After the war, Congress established the Council of Economic Advisors, which was charged with advising the president on the economic health of the nation. In 1946, Republicans would take control of both houses of Congress under the slogan, "Had enough," and passed the Taft-Hartley Labor Act. It banned closed shops to try to counteract the power of the union. A closed shop is where only union workers could be hired. So the Republicans wanted to go away from that. They wanted to allow anybody to be hired, not just somebody who served in a union. Union shops were only allowed if permitted by state law, and union leaders had to take an oath that they weren't members of the Communist Party. This becomes something that's more important through the late 1940s and early 50s. Truman vetoed the bill, but it was later overturned. The National Security Act of 1947 made the Joint Chiefs of Staff permanent, so the military being part of the president's cabinet, and led to the creation of the CIA. The CIA was meant to coordinate the gathering of global intelligence to help prevent something like World War II happening again. The pragmatic Roosevelt had expected that the great powers in the post-war world would have separate geographical spheres of influence, but he believed he had to temper such realpolitik with an organization which would, quote, satisfy the widespread demand of the United States for new idealistic or universalist arrangements for assuring the peace. So what he does what he establishes is the beginning of the United Nations. He died on April 12, 1945, but Harry Truman, on April 25, 1945, when Truman was president, the Charter of the United States was drawn up 2 weeks before Germany surrendered. It created two agencies. the General Assembly, which would meet yearly, made up of all member nations, and the Security Council. Most of the power lies in the Security Council. The Security Council always remains in session and has the responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The permanent members of the Security Council at that time included the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. During World War II, as the Red Army swept westwards toward Berlin, it retook land from the Nazis and installed puppet governments. Although this violated an agreement it had signed, the USSR did not see it as a violation but as self-defense. When Truman inherited the presidency, he noted the crumbling alliance with the Russians. Churchill made this comment, quote, "What is to happen about Europe? An iron curtain is drawn down upon the Eastern Front. We do not know what is going on behind it. Surely it is vital now to come to an understanding with Russia or see where we are with her before we weaken our armies mortally," unquote. To pacify the Soviets, the United States removed all their troops from the occupation zone in Germany because at that point they still needed their help to ward off Japan at the end of World War II. Stalin later made it evident that peace would not be possible, quote, "under the present capitalist development of the world economy." Communists really hate capitalists, so he was trying to insult all capitalists throughout the world. The Yalta Conference ensured that democracy would be the standard for Eastern European affairs, not a federal democratic republic like the United States. The Soviets controlled most of Eastern Europe and would not budge their views. To protect Russian expansion in Europe and Asia, Secretary of State George Kennan argued that the U.S. policy must be one of containing the Russians where they already are. He predicted that the Soviets would try to fill every nook and cranny available in the basin of world power. Therefore, he insisted the United States must pursue, quote, "a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies," unquote. We're going to read a lot of George Kennan's information in the document booklet. It's not the complete thing, but it's a lot of it. So this is where the idea that containment is introduced, that we need to keep communism in its sphere of the world and not to let it spread anywhere else. It becomes the backbone for U.S.-Soviet diplomacy for the next 4 decades, this idea of containment. Truman introduced a policy, now known as the Truman Doctrine, in which aid to nations currently under attack by Soviet forces, either in secret or in public, was freely given. We're also going to read the Truman Doctrine in our document booklet. Truman said these words to Congress in 1947, quote, "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." And that's the founding statement of the Truman Doctrine, which we'll read about a little bit more. To help the still ravaged landscape of Europe and food shortages, George Marshall, the new Secretary of State for Truman, introduced a plan to provide aid to any European nation that requested it. Although they were originally part of it, the Soviets viewed this act as an imperialist scheme and later did not endorse the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan drew Western European nations closer together, but it drove the United States and the U.S. farther apart. In 1948, France, Great Britain, and America still united their zones of occupation in Germany. They then organized a new democratically elected government. The Soviets, the only communist member of the Allies, resented this action and began to restrict road and rail access from West Berlin, which was free. A blockade was then put on the city, and the only way that its citizens received food, coal, or medicine for months was a massive American airlift of goods. Another document in our document booklet talks about that, the Berlin airlift. On April 4th, 1949, which happens to be its anniversary this week, on April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, creating NATO, which pledged that an attack against one member was an attack against all and would be responded to as such. NATO sounds an awful lot like the tripartite alliance that Italy, Germany, and Japan signed during World War II. But this was to help prevent an attack from an aggressor nation, not so much just an alliance in case we want to go to war. In 1948, Palestine, which had been under Ottoman rule until the dissolution of that empire, was a British protectorate. It was then partitioned between Arab and Jewish settlers, creating the Jewish state of Israel. The United States was the first nation to recognize Israel as a new nation, and almost immediately afterward, the neighboring Arab states attacked Israel. Eventually, a peace was declared, and Israel joined the UN. I know that we often think of civil rights as an issue that happened during the late 1950s and early 60s, but the foundations for the civil rights movement actually began during the Truman administration. After the war, civil rights activists were able to draw on the horror of state-sponsored discrimination in Germany, Japan, and Italy to make comparisons to American problems. In 1948, Harry Truman banned racial discrimination in the hiring of federal employees. Then he integrated the armed forces, which had been sent to World War II, is separated by color as they fought in Germany and in the Pacific. While this was occurring, Jackie Robinson was making his own case by being the first African American to play Major League Baseball. By his performance, he was able to illustrate that segregation was based on racism, not African Americans' supposed inferiority. During this era is when the actual term racism begins to take root in the minds of Americans, and this is a term, of course, that we still use today. After 3 years in office, Truman was finding being FDR's successor very difficult. He ran for his own term in 1948 and was considered by most political analysts to be a lost cause. The Chicago Tribune even published headlines that he was going to be defeated in the election. We'll talk about that in a second. In his State of the Union address, he outlined what was going to become his, quote, fair deal program, ensuring the human rights of U.S. citizens, protecting human resources, and extending government programs for the unemployed and the retired. The Democrats did nominate Truman for his own term. The Republicans nominated Thomas Dewey, governor of New York. In an act of defiance against Truman's support of civil rights, a third party, known as the Dixiecrats, owing to its makeup of former Confederate states, split from the Democrats. On the election day, Truman actually won. Here is a copy of the Chicago Tribune that says that Dewey defeats Truman. Not exactly true, because I'm sure none of you even know who Thomas Dewey is, but you do know who Harry Truman is, I hope. In China, the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek had been fighting the communist forces of Mao Zedong since the 20s. During World War II, both sides halted their civil war and fought the Japanese. I told you a couple of times that's the reason that the Japanese were vulnerable to, or the Chinese were vulnerable to attack. It's not because the Japanese were so much stronger, it's because they were distracted by this interior revolution. Once peace was obtained, America supported the restoration of the nationalists, even though it was widely believed that they were too corrupt to stand on their own. This is following this new, quote, containment policy that President Truman and George Kennan championed. Soon after, civil war erupted again, and the nationalists were forced from China to the island of Formosa, which is called Taiwan today. It would be 30 years before the communist government in China was formally recognized by the United States. In Vietnam, the United States would try to bolster their alliances by supporting the French, who had colonies there, against the communist forces of Ho Chi Minh. Now, this is very important. I talked to you about in our presentation, when we did notes on this, that the French had held Indochina, that it got run over by the Japanese a couple of times. They were forced to build airstrips there, and then the Japanese took control of it. Well, the French took it back, and the United States wanted to help this government become independent of French authority and become their own countries. And so we start sending stuff into the area to help fight against, help this containment idea of keeping the communists out. In Vietnam, the United States would try to fight them against Ho Chi Minh, and about that same time, it was revealed that the Soviets had successfully detonated an atomic bomb of their own. Truman thus funded the construction of a more powerful weapon, which is called the hydrogen bomb, and he was hoping to beat the Soviets to the creation of the hydrogen bomb. After the war, Japan lost their claim to the Korean Peninsula, which they had occupied since 1910. The Allies tried to establish a new government there, but the act was hindered by Soviet forces, which had advanced into Korea and defeated the Japanese forces in the north. Much like the Germany situation, the Allies agreed to divide the nation at the 38th parallel. On each side of the border, separate governments were created resembling its supporting nations. On June 25, 1950, South Korean soldiers attacked South Korea, crossing the 38th parallel. Truman sent in forces under the auspices of the UN, which is against the Constitution. Instead of having war declared by Congress, he sent in troops because the UN said that we could send in troops. First time in history that troops had been sent in to an active war zone without the approval of Congress. Truman decided that the Korean conflict was actually a diversion for a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, so he began a major expansion of American forces in NATO. While dispatching U.S. military units to Korea and Europe, Truman increased assistance to the French troops in Indochina, creating the Military Assistance Advisory Group for Indochina. And this marked the official start to our involvement in Vietnam. On June 25, 1950, Korean soldiers attacked South Korea. Truman sent in forces under the auspices of the UN. For almost 3 years of civil war, an armistice was signed. that ended the fighting and reestablished the border back at the 38th parallel. Now, this sounds an awful lot like World War I, where I'm going to go back a slide so you can see this map. It sounds an awful lot like World War I, where after they fight for a few years, everybody just retreats back to where they had been when the war started. So that's kind of what happened in Korea. The truce line followed the front at the time, mostly a little north of the 38th parallel. There was a demilitarized zone that separated the forces. No peace conference ever took place, and Korea, like Germany, remained divided. The war cost the United States more than 33,000 deaths and 103,000 wounded or missing during the Korean conflict. So anyway, now we'll move on to the sphere of communism. The Korean War exacerbated the American public's anti-communist fear, which was termed the Red Scare. The first time this had happened had been right during World War I, and now it became a even fiercer, more feared reality. To prevent communist invasion of key government positions, Truman established procedures to keep them out of office, to keep communists out of office. Those who were in or had been in office were tried. The most famous cases were Alger Hiss, who was found guilty for lying about espionage against the United States. Alger Hiss held prominent government positions under FDR, attended the Yalta Conference, and helped author the actual UN Charter. So he was convicted of being guilty of being a communist. The most vocal of the Red Scare was Joseph McCarthy. As a senator from Wisconsin, he would stir up anti-communist feelings and engage in a hunt for communist spies in the government. His efforts resulted in not one actual discovery of a communist, but he did successfully fan the fires of fear of a communist invasion. The Cold War was basically a war of ideology. That's why I call it Cold War. There wasn't a major engagement. I mean, we did have engagements in Korea, engagements in Vietnam. We have later engagements in Afghanistan and some other places. But it's mostly the idea that communists hate capitalists and hate America, and Americans were trying to contain the influence of communism throughout the world by fighting it as it started spreading in little places. Unlike during World War II, where they started to appease Hitler by giving him the Rhineland or giving him the Sudetenland, we wanted to stop it before the fire got really big. This world where there was the fight against communism and the fear of traitors being in power is a far cry from the world of 1796, when George Washington, in his farewell address, warned against, quote, those overgrown military establishments which are inauspicious to liberty. And he advised his country, quote, to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. But Washington warned only against participation in ordinary combinations and collusions of Europe. And the post-war years were extraordinary, and they were scary. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in class, of maybe some ideas of what should they done instead. Should we have just withdrawn back into our isolationist tendencies and stayed to ourselves, or should we have done something to help stop the spread of communism throughout the world? And that becomes the basic question from the close of World War II until the end of the Cold War during George Herbert Walker Bush's administration. So bring your notes to class. We'll come prepared to discuss this presentation. We will try to get through most of this in class this week. We probably won't get through all of it, but we'll get through most of it, and then we'll have a discussion more about post-war America when you come to class. So have a great week, and I'll see you in class this week.